All right, so second time I'm giving this talk today. It was so intimate over there. I was really enjoying having a small audience. All right, so I'm a professor at the University of Washington, do computer vision and computer graphics. I also run a research group at Google in the Seattle office working on maps. And so we should probably, I'm assuming you want to still end on time, so.
No, you can go later.
You sure?
Yeah, definitely if you go like 10 minutes late, no problem.
Okay.
Even 15 is fine.
All right. Since some people have heard the first 10 minutes already, I think I'll skip through it a little bit more quickly. But basically, there are a lot of photos out there. There are 6 billion photos uploaded to Facebook every month, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. If you probably only a subset of the photos that are uploaded to Facebook, a small subset of the photos that people take are uploaded to Facebook, right? So even if you use Facebook, you probably don't upload every single photo that you take to Facebook. And so, very conservative estimate, if 15 photos are taken in the world for every one uploaded to Facebook, then that means there are about 1 trillion photos taken every year, right? So there's lots and lots of photos out there in the world. So the question is, what's happening to these photos? And really, the situation isn't much different than it was for our parents and grandparents. You know, even though we all have digital cameras now and we have photo sharing tools and so forth, it's essentially our photos go into a shoebox in the attic that we rarely ever look at again. But in this case, instead of a physical shoebox, it's a digital shoebox. So photos are on our hard drives and iPhoto and Facebook and tools like this. But really, you never look at your photos, or very rarely do you ever look at your photos if you're anything like me. In fact, I've only seen about half of the photos I've taken. So I have, I have a 6-year-old son. I've taken 10,000 photos of him, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually, I think, on par with most of the other parents I've talked to. Although, the real photographers, avid photographers, will take hundreds and thousands of photos of their kids. I have friends who've done that. And those photos I take on my camera, I upload to the computer, and then I never see them again. So I actually haven't seen half of the photos I've taken, which is pretty pathetic. So I think in a few years, so this is one of the areas where the tools that we have now are extremely primitive. Tools like iPhoto and Picasa and Facebook, at least the sharing part, they do a small number of things very well, but they don't let you get access to your own photos. And I think these things are very important to people. Like, when I think about if I were to lose my hard drive, what would I care most about losing, right? It wouldn't be my email or my tax records or anything like that. It would be my photos, right? So this obviously is really important data. Okay, so let's look at what some of those photos look like. So this is one of the premier photo sharing sites. It's called Flickr.com. Many of you have either seen it or used it. But it's a way that you can share photos online. And you can also tag photos. And what that means is that then you and other people can search for photos. So if you type in just about any search term, you'll get a zillion photos matching that search term, whether it be chandeliers or birds or beaches or whatever. And these are photos that people have taken and uploaded. They're pretty high quality photos, multi-megapixels often, typically. And so they're very good for doing computer vision type analysis. And so this type of collection is very popular among computer vision researchers. So let's look at one particular search query. This is Rome. And so if you type in the city of Rome, you get, when I made this slide a couple of years ago now, I got 1 million hits. And now it's probably more like 5 million, I'm guessing. And these are photos that people have uploaded of their trip to Rome, primarily. So here's a typical photo from this collection. And this is, this is obviously a couple's vacation photo that they meant to share with their family and friends. And they probably didn't intend me to be showing this photo to you or me to be doing computer vision research on it. But that's just how it happens with photo sharing online. And so this photo by itself isn't particularly interesting, to most people at least, but in aggregate these photos become more interesting. So if I look at 50 photos of Rome, I start to see the highlights of the city. So here's Trevi Fountain, there's the Colosseum, there's the Pantheon, and that's the Vatican. All right, so you're starting to see a summary of the city. It's not complete, so there's no photo of the Pope, so I have to repeat my jokes. It's horrible. The 10 people in the room before have heard. So if you download 200 images, there's one of the Pope, but it's still incomplete. So there's no image of the Sistine Chapel that I could find in this collection. Sistine Chapel is my favorite spot in Rome. So if you download 800 images, lo and behold, there's a photo of the Sistine Chapel, and there's actually a couple more. And now we're starting to get images from different viewpoints, which makes of the same thing, like the Sistine Chapel, and that makes it more interesting from a computer vision point of view as well. If you want to get a more complete coverage, you might download 20,000 photos, and the full collection looks like this. Actually, now there's 5 pages like this. So the question is, what if we process this collection using modern computer vision algorithms? What can we reconstruct out of the city of Rome from this collection? All right. So let me start by introducing one of the key tools that the computer vision community has now. And this is something called SIFT, which is Scale Invariant Feature Transform. This is developed by David Lowe at UBC. And this is really one of the biggest breakthroughs of the decade in computer vision, if not ever in the entire field. Essentially what it is a way of detecting and matching features which are descriptive enough and unique enough that you can reliably match them between different images of the same thing. And they have lots of other uses, but they're just much more robust than you would expect them to be. And I'll show you a couple of examples. But first of all, every square here is a feature at a different position, orientation, and scale. And I won't go into details, but essentially the algorithms are detecting things that look something like corners in many cases, but not exactly. And then they're describing a window of pixels around each point by looking at distributions of edge orientations. This turns out to be a very robust descriptor. So the idea is that once you've found one of these features, you can reliably find it in another image. So here's some impressive examples of that. 2 images of the Trevi Fountain from this collection I just described. These little colored squares in the background are features that have been matched. And so this corner of this window corresponds to this corner of this window, and so forth. And this is pretty incredible. So if you think about it, these images are taken completely different times. Broad daylight on the left, nighttime on the right. There are people occluding the thing in the background on the left, but not on the right, but that doesn't matter. Or at least we're able to get a lot of features despite that. The viewpoints are different. There's water, all sorts of stuff is happening. But this still works. Also, these feature matching methods work in, there's implementations that work in real time, meaning on video, like 30 frames a second and so forth. So this works really well. This is another example which I think is even more impressive. So these are 2 images from surface of Mars, and it turns out they overlap. I'm guessing you wouldn't have been able to tell that just by looking at these 2 images. But in a fraction of a second, this algorithm can find these features in the upper left are actually the same part of the scene as the features in the lower right of the second image. All right. So again, think of this happening at 30 frames a second. So this is an area where computer vision, I think, has surpassed human performance. Okay. Anyway, so this is a huge enabler. So suppose that we have this collection. Now we can start matching these images together. Okay. So I'm going to take every one of these images and match it with every other image. So pairwise matching. And we have ways of accelerating that and so forth, so it doesn't just blow up. But if you do that, you get this. Okay, so now what I'm showing you is a graph. Every red dot in this image is a photo, and a blue edge is between two photos that share features. So you're seeing basically clumps of images in common in this. And this is not the full million set of Rome. This is 20,000 photos of Rome displayed here as clumps. And one thing to notice is that we don't get one big giant connected component of Rome. It breaks up into pieces, mainly because people don't take photos of everything in Rome, every little street corner, everything on the street. They just take photos of the highlights, and so we have big clumps of those highlights and big gaps between them. So that's just part of the problem. So these clumps actually correspond to the popular tourist sites. So there's the Colosseum. In fact, this is the inside of the Colosseum. This is the outside. You'll notice actually it's topologically a circle because you can walk around it, which makes sense. And similarly for the inside. Anyway, so these clumps, actually these two clumps for Trevi Fountain, the big clump actually corresponds to daytime images, a small clump is nighttime images. And there's a little bridge between them because there's a few images that we're able to match between day and night. So it's not necessarily geometry you're seeing, you're also seeing other reasons for connecting images together, like or segmenting them based on illumination and so forth. All right. Okay, so given this, what can we do? So the next thing we wanted to try was running 3D reconstruction algorithms. Okay, so can we create 3D models of the city from these images? And indeed, the techniques in computer vision called structure from motion are designed to take matched photos like we have on the left and produce 3D models. Now, people hadn't run them on these internet collections before, but we saw no reason why you couldn't build a system to do that. So next, I'm going to be describing some of our efforts to do that. All right, so first of all, let me describe what structure from motion is, and I would say this is one of the other big breakthroughs in computer vision over the last decade or so. And this came out of a couple of different communities. One is computer vision, another one is photogrammetry. And basically the idea is you're given some unknown 3D scene, which you're assuming is rigid. And here it's just this cube. And you also have projections of that scene, so 3 photos, but from unknown camera positions, okay? And I have a set of feature correspondences, which I'm coloring here, so the red point corresponds to the same feature in the scene. And that is the the input, these feature correspondences. So my goal is to recover the 3D positions of these features in the scene, and then also the camera parameters, which I'm denoting here as rotation R and translation T of the camera. And there's other things like focal lengths and radial distortion and various other things you can estimate as well. Okay? And so how do you solve this problem? Well, so even though we don't know the geometry or the cameras, if I told you what the answer was, so if I told you this is the geometry, these are the positions of the 3D points, and here are the camera positions, you could verify if my answer is correct, right? Because you could simply take each 3D point, project it into the image, because I told you where the cameras were, and then measure the distance between the projected point and the actual observed feature point, right? And if they line up, then we have some confidence that we got the answer right, and if they don't, then you're wrong, right? And so we can just define an error function, which is the difference between the projection of the candidate 3D point and the observed feature, okay? So if we add up all those so-called projection, or sometimes called reprojection errors, then we get an error function, which I'm denoting f, which is the function of the camera parameters R and T and the 3D scene points. Okay, so that gives me a big nonlinear optimization problem, a cost function I can minimize, and you can use your favorite nonlinear optimization techniques to minimize it. Of course, because it's nonlinear, you have to initialize it very carefully, and there's a whole black art in trying to get it to run and converge to the right solution, and lots of research, but this is basically the problem. All right, so let me kind of jump to the chase and show you some of the results. And if there are questions, I can talk more about how we do this. But what I'm going to show you now is kind of a time-lapse view of our reconstruction process. So we start out with a pair, we select a pair of images that are particularly well suited for reconstruction because they have the right combination of baseline and feature overlap. Baseline meaning camera separation. And then we're going to reconstruct the scene that is visible from that pair of images, and then we're going to gradually add more and more cameras, rerunning the nonlinear optimization at every step. And here's what it looks like. First, here's one camera, but actually we start with two. And you'll see more and more photos added, and then these points in the background are the reconstructed points in the scene. Now, I wish this actually ran as fast as this video goes. At the time, it certainly didn't. We now have a version which uses GPUs and multi-core and so forth, which is getting close to this rate. It's not quite that rate, but you can actually see the reconstruction grow incrementally. And this is work by my graduate student, Noah Snavely, who's now on faculty at Cornell, and my collaborator, Rick Slisky at Microsoft. Okay, so given that, so we did this work about 5 years ago or so, so then the question was, well, can you scale this up to city scale? Could you do this? So could I throw these methods at this collection? What would I get out of it? How much of the city of Rome can I reconstruct from the images on the internet? So we worked on this for a year and a half, and as we got closer, we realized that we could up the ante and try to do it in a day of computing time, just using a large cluster, mainly because we wanted to say we reconstructed Rome in a day. So the idea was, there are on the order of 1 million images. We had access to a large compute cluster on loan from Microsoft. Microsoft Research was building a new compute cluster at the time, which had on the order of 1,000 cores. And they were literally building it. It wasn't ready yet. And we were the only users, which is why we were able to use it. And unfortunately, we were also the ones to debug the cluster. So it took a lot of work. But anyway, so that was the goal. This is Samir Agrawal, he was my postdoc at the time. Now he's at Google. So the goal was to reconstruct the city in a day of compute. And I'll show you, again, I'll just kind of show you the results, and I'm happy to answer questions on the algorithms and details. So turns out we didn't get to a full million because of a variety of constraints involving the cluster and images and so forth. So we worked with a collection of 150,000 photos, and this was the largest chunk of geometry that popped out, which is the Colosseum. So it turns out more people take photos of the Colosseum than anything else in Rome. And so this is our largest piece of the most photos that we had in Rome of a single thing. All those little black dots are camera positions. So if you went to Rome, you took a photo, you uploaded it to Flickr, we figured out where you're standing when you took your photo. You're somewhere in this collection, most likely. All right, so here's what it looks like, zoomed in a little bit. And again, you're seeing a rather sparse geometry reconstruction. So these are the 3D points corresponding to these SIF features that we matched. So that one was the largest, but not the most interesting. I really like this one. This is another chunk of Rome. This is St. Peter's. But what's cool about this is this is actually the inside of St. Peter's Cathedral, but viewed from the outside. It's like one of these Hitchcock-like impossible views. So I'll show you as we zoom in, you'll see that it's actually the inside. So here we are inside. You can walk down and look up into the dome. So you'll notice that there are these camera positions up here. What's that?
There's a balcony there.
Exactly, there's a balcony. You can actually walk up, there's some stairs up the back, and look in through those windows. And so those were not actually errors, they're actually people standing up there or outside looking in, taking photos. All right. So I was joking that we did Rome in a day to say that we could build Rome in a day, but actually the nice thing about it is then the next day you can do another city. Okay, so the next day we did Venice, And this is a bigger collection, 250,000 images. And here's the largest chunk of Venice. It's actually the largest reconstruction of its type to date. So you see all the cameras down at the bottom, almost like pigeons in the square. If you're familiar with this square, you'll know what I mean. Yeah, so incredibly dense. I mean, there are some errors. I mean, it's unlikely. Maybe there's, a hang glider or a helicopter, but these are probably errors. We were sort of hoping we'd get everything connected, the Grand Canal, and that would continue, but in this collection we didn't actually get that. I suspect if we downloaded the full collection of Venice, we might have been able to do that. Here's another piece of it. This is one of the canals. You can swoop down to water taxi level and up to the Rialto Bridge. And this is fun because you'll notice people take photos from every possible position along the bridge. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that you can start analyzing the distribution of photos in the world, the photos that people take, where they stand, and where they take photos. And we haven't really done that yet, but it's a really interesting source of data to look at. All right, this is another city we did, and actually we kind of did this on a lark. We kind of needed a smaller kind of debugging city, and my collaborator Rick suggested, why not Dubrovnik? So he said, okay, yeah, let's do Dubrovnik. This turned out to be the best, and it's smaller in terms of number of images. There's about 65,000 photos of Dubrovnik on Flickr, at least when we did this experiment, and we used all of them. But what's cool about this city is that it's on a hill, and so there are photos from above, essentially aerial photos. You can also walk on a wall around the city and take photos at rooftop level. And because you have these different heights, the higher views tend to show multiple things together, and so it really allows you to stitch together these otherwise disparate things. So whereas in Rome it broke up into little pieces, for Dubrovnik we basically get the whole old city at least in one big chunk. And this is what we were really hoping to get for Rome, but obviously weren't able to get. But it shows the potential here. So let me show you what this looks like. We're starting out on the hill, going down. Here's rooftop level, down to the street level. So there's one clock tower, I guess, and a cathedral over here. And we'll pull up in a second, back up to the mountain. And there's one thing, there are these islands also on the side which are reconstructed, which you'll see as we turn around in a second. And then the hillside behind it. And of course, if there were more photos going over that ridge, they would be reconstructed as well, and it would just keep marching, all through, just keep going. So it's pretty good at matching things together and reconstructing things which fit together. Anyway, so this is as far as we got with that project. One of the limitations here is that you get these fairly sparse kind of pointillist-like models, impressionist-like models, as opposed to what most people would think is true 3D geometry. So a natural question is, can you do better? Can you get denser geometry? And indeed, there are techniques for getting denser geometry, like stereo techniques, as they're known in the computer vision community. But they generally don't work for these kinds of unstructured photo collections. And so we've done a lot of work in our group and in other groups for developing algorithms that work on this sort of imagery to get dense geometry. And this is work by former postdoc Yasu Furukawa, who's also at Google now. This is a dense reconstruction of the same thing. Here it is with just the structure for motion points. Here it is with stereo. And now it's basically like a laser scan. And in fact, these algorithms are on par with a laser scan in terms of accuracy. So it's like we laser scanned the Colosseum, but just use people's vacation photos to do it. And so this is pretty exciting. So I'll show you some more comparisons. Here's the inside of St. Peter's with structure for motion, and here it is with stereo on the right. So you're seeing the dense geometry. So again, we didn't take any photos ourselves. You know, I have a computer vision lab down in the basement, but I never use it. Don't tell my department chair, because now I just use everyone else's photos on the internet to process. All right, so here's another example. This is this San Marco Plaza in Venice. I just showed you this data set before with all the pigeons. Here it is in dense 3D. Same data, but now we're doing more processing on it. And you can get really accurate details. Like, I like this sculpture of the lion with wings. And there are obviously holes in areas which weren't well covered from photos. But the more photos there are in an area, the better geometry you get. You'll see the back of the square is less well photographed, so it has a lot more holes and errors and so forth. But that's this is sort of the state of the art right now of where, you know, computer vision techniques, I think, are capable of in terms of 3D geometry from photo collections. All right, let me go back here. So one thing I want to point out, though, is that I think the first time you see the video that I just showed, I think it looks pretty good. But the more you look at it, I think the more you see the errors and the holes, and, you know, it basically looks like a bombed-out version of the city of Venice. And it's also missing all the stuff that happens in the real world in that site. That, you know, so this is a real photo of Venice, right? You know, there are birds, as I just mentioned. There's a sky, and occasionally there's a cloud in Italy, apparently. There are shadows, and, you know, there's people and all sorts of stuff. And so it's hard to you can't really capture these dynamic effects with this primitive of representation. So more recently, we started to look at how can you bring back the photographic detail, because, you know, after all, we have, you know, hundreds of thousands of photos of this place. We should be able to use all that stuff to render it more photographically realistically. Okay, so here's an attempt to do that. This is work which is in progress. We haven't published this yet. Here what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you rendering of this clock tower in Venice, using not just the geometry, but warping one photo to the next. And here's what it looks like. So now you really are seeing the photos. You also notice that's taking you on a tour of these different parts of the clock tower. And actually, we're computing that tour automatically because we know the distribution of photos of this thing, and we actually know the most common photographs. And we're making sure that we pause on the most common photographs. And you can also think of so in which order should you visit all of these spots on the clock tower? Well, you know, that's essentially a traveling salesman problem, right? You want to find a tour through these photos which optimizes certain criteria. Okay, so we're running traveling salesman algorithms to compute this tour. Here's so I think with that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing at Google. So I mentioned I'm running a group at Google. So I had a chance after we did this work to spend some time at Google to start a computer vision group working on building next generation maps. And this is appealing to me because basically, you know, Google has a lot of photos, access to a lot of photos, some that like the tourist photos, but also that Google takes itself through driving cars and flying planes and so forth. There's obviously lots of compute resources. We had trouble getting 1,000 cores. In fact, when I gave a version of this talk at Google a couple of years ago, sort of bragging that, you know, we did this reconstruction with 1,000 cores, and people were kind of looking at me like, 1,000 cores? I mean, eat that for breakfast. So lots of compute access, and then I was able to hire a really spectacular 3D computer vision team, including a couple of my postdocs and other really excellent people in the field. So this has really been exciting, and so I'd like to show you some of what we built so far. Most of it actually isn't out yet, but if the internet connection is good enough, I was having some trouble in the other room. We'll see how this goes. What are you complaining about? No, I don't need to know that. Well, let's just try this, and if I have trouble, I'll. So this is Google Maps, maps.google.com, and this is satellite mode. If you used that before, and so this is image of the city of Rome because I'm talking about Rome. So you can see the Colosseum in the middle, and so as we zoom in, you'll see higher res imagery coming in, and something which is relatively new now that Google has are these oblique views. So 45-degree angle views. And one thing that's kind of neat here is that you see this transition, you probably almost don't even notice it, between the top-down view and the oblique view when I go up and down. This is actually really hard to do, to produce a smooth transition. It's very subtle. And you actually need 3D geometry to do it right. And so what we've actually done is from the aerial imagery themselves, we've computed the geometry for everything in the city from the aerial level. And so here's another use of that. We can actually rotate around the Colosseum, and again, we're using 3D models to do this rotation. And again, this is using stereo techniques like what we use to create the 3D models at ground level from tourist photos. Same kind of techniques, but from the air. So here's where I'm testing the network bandwidth, but we'll see. So now I'm going to swoop down to ground level, and now it turns out that there's street view coverage inside. It's not loading in the next panorama. There's street view inside the Colosseum as well. So they actually ran kind of a street view cart inside. So you can go in, and on a good connection, this would look better. Take my word for it. And of course, you can pan around the Colosseum. So anyway, this is one of the things we've been doing in my group, trying to essentially take all the imagery that Google has, both at the aerial level, at the ground level, integrate it, build 3D models, produce better transitions, and so forth. All right. So this is called Maps GL. This is the latest version of the Maps product that runs on certain browsers. It doesn't run on all laptops. It requires a pretty good graphics card, but it's getting better and better. All right. So for the last part of the talk, I want to switch focus to the topic of modeling people. So most photos in the world, or photos that we care about, don't look like the ones that I've been showing you up to this point in the talk, right? So, I have, as I mentioned, I have over 10,000 photos in my photo collection at home, and I think 95% at least are of my son, and so most of the photos that we look at are of people. So the question is, what can you do with photos of people along similar lines? So these are certain types of people, celebrities. So here's a search on Google Images for George Bush. And so I love doing experiments on George Bush's face. It's not exactly a political statement, exactly, but he's just very expressive. So especially in images like this, which, but if you do searches, like the Rome search, you get zillions of images of the city of Rome. If you do a search for any particular celebrity or well-known public figure, you'll get zillions of photos of that person. And so the question is, well, what can I do with these images of George Bush? Can I create a 3D model of him from his photos, right? Why not? So none of the methods I've talked to up to this point will work, right? Because they all assume that you have 3D rigid geometry, which doesn't change. Of course, humans are not like that. So you need completely different techniques. So let me walk you through a process that we've found for getting pretty good 3D geometry of people. So here I'm taking all those images of George Bush. Turns out you can use face detection techniques to detect the face and to just do automatic cropping, and that works pretty well. Using other techniques, it turns out you can warp the images to near frontal. So this is sort of a side view. You can warp it to near frontal, and I'm not going to go into the details, but that also works reasonably well. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. By the way, this is the work of my postdoc, Ira Kemmelmacher. And okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take all these photos and we're going to put them in a matrix. And by that I mean each photo of George Bush, we're going to unwrap it so it's a vector of pixels. And then that vector is going to become the first column of this matrix. Take the next image, the next column of the matrix, etc. So there's a column in this matrix for every photo there is of George Bush. And the number of rows is the number of pixels in each image, normalized, say. Okay, so what are the properties of this matrix, right? Here I'm showing you the same images. I've just removed the color channels because we're going to be doing this processing in grayscale, as it turns out. So here are the photos, and you can see the expression and lighting is different in every single photo. This would be a very difficult data set to do computer vision algorithms on because there's so much variability. Now, if you do singular value decomposition or PCA, you do a rank 4 approximation, and there's a reason to use 4, which I'll describe in a second. Something pretty incredible happens. The expression is normalized. So he has the same expression in every single image, but the lighting is retained. Okay? So this is a good approximation of the original lighting in the image, but the expression has been normalized. Okay, so somehow by doing this, I've converted a data set which is very difficult to analyze into something that even traditional computer vision algorithms can process. Like, it's as if George Bush had walked into my lab and stood still, and I'd taken photos of his face from the same viewpoint under different illuminations, right? And so if I have a photo set like that, I can use traditional multi-view shape from shading algorithms. There's techniques called photometric stereo, which do this. Take a set of photos like this, same viewpoint, different illuminations, same rigid scene. And I'll just give you a brief review of photometric stereo because it's just so elegant. You should know about it. So here's this matrix that I've created of the photos. Turns out there's a factorization of this matrix as a product of two smaller matrices, product of a light matrix and essentially a shape matrix, which contains the surface normals. And so turns out you can factorize this as a product of these two matrices using singular value decomposition again. And under the assumption of Lambertian reflectance, if you don't know what that means, that's okay. Just means it's a diffuse reflectance. Then this matrix, and no shadows, then this matrix should be rank 3. Under slightly different conditions, it should be rank 4. And anyway, there's these classical rank results. And so essentially what this means is that you can take this matrix, factor it into use SVD to reduce the rank, and then factor into these two submatrices and extract the light source directions and the surface normals of the object. And then you can integrate out the shape from the surface normals. So turns out we had to add a few bells and whistles to really make that work, and I'll describe one of those. But this works pretty well. So let me show you. Let me show you a result. Okay, so this is George Bush. Ladies and gentlemen, I present George Bush. So here's his face in 3D. And this was reconstructed only from those images that I just showed you on, or hundreds of images like that from the internet. And it does a pretty good job. it's not perfect, but it's getting a lot of details. And we haven't actually had the chance to verify. We're still in contact with his handlers, but hopefully he'll let us do some measurements. And so, but the key thing is that you can do this with anyone, right? Anyone who has photos, you can create 3D models of their face. So it works reasonably well with politicians for some reason. One thing you'll notice is it's only giving you one model, right? So we have this one model of George Bush. Clearly the shape of his face changes. He goes through different expressions. We're generating kind of a consensus average reconstruction through this process, which means that it's going to tell you the most common expression. So in the case of Tony Blair apparently smiles more than most politicians. So our model of Blair it contains a smile, while Rumsfeld seems to have a scowl. And celebrities, of course, here, this shows you kind of the accuracy of the model. This is a rendering of the geometry to a new view, which wasn't in the data set. So you can see there's a pretty good match. This is qualitative, obviously, not quantitative, but there's a pretty good match to the photo. And you can see the geometry is pretty well captured. All right. So again, most of our photos are not actually of celebrities either, right? They're of our kids and our family and friends and so forth. So what can we do with that kind of collection? And this really, I think, is the holy grail, like, retrieving all the photos, doing something interesting with the photos of my 6-year-old. I'd like to reconstruct, basically bring him to life through these photos. I mean, he's alive, but make the photos make the photos dynamic and be able to, to really explore the photo collection more in a more immersive way. All right, so this is a photo collection of a colleague of mine's daughter, who has kindly donated. She's agreed to this. Her photos. So here's his photo collection. He has about 100,000 photos of his daughter. I'm not going to show you all of them, but here's a subset from 0 to age, she's in her 20s now, early 20s. So this is what his photo collection looks like. And of course, it's very, just a random set of photos. So what we wanted to do was say, okay, could we create a visualization of his daughter from this photo collection through the years? All right? So the first thing you might try is just playing the images chronologically, order them chronologically, and cropping the photos like I showed you before. And we can also align them. Okay, and I'll show you what that looks like. So here she is as a baby. We've detected the faces and aligned them. And here I'm showing you sequence of images, more or less from birth. And I'm not going to let you wait and sit here until she gets to 20, because that would be about 15 minutes or something like that. So it's kind of interesting. It's not as dramatic as we hoped it would be. Partly because there's so much going on here. The pose is changing, the lighting is changing, the hair is changing, the clothes is changing, everything is changing. So the next thing we tried was said, okay, well, let's limit the time period to, say, 30 seconds, just to make it reasonable. And so our goal is to give you the best possible video in 30 seconds, which best summarizes her through the ages. And we also want to make it as smooth as possible. Okay, so we're going to make the changes in expression and changes in pose as smooth as possible. Okay, so this is like your life in 30 seconds, basically. And essentially, this is a dynamic programming problem, right? Because you're trying to find the optimal path through this photo collection with the edge cost terms on the edge cost measure difference in pose and difference in expression, basically. Okay, so if you run this optimization, this is what you get. So you can see the mouth is open. Now it closes, and it's closed for a while. Then it's open for a while. But what's cool about this is you can really see her age, before your eyes. These are the angsty teenage years. Hair changes color many times. By the way, I should say, so girls turn out, so we've done a bunch of these now, so girls are infinitely more interesting than boys. So there's a grad student who worked with me on this project as well. This is really Ira's work. And he had a photo collection of himself, and we played it, and it basically didn't change. He had the same smile in every single photo, and his hair was about the same, and it's really funny. All right, so yeah, so here we had timestamps for every single photo, and that's not an easy problem for the older photos, especially. Her father went back and timestamped every single photo. All right, so yeah, some of these had to be scanned in, and he had to estimate. Well, this was on so and so a date. So, okay, so when I started at Google a couple of years ago, I mentioned this opportunity to start a computer vision group at Google. And we had just done this project at the university as a research project, and I thought, well, it would be crazy not to do this at Google, because there's something like iPhoto. They have something called Picasa, which is a photo organizer, and so we should do this in Picasa. And so I had Ira and this grad student Rahul, whose face doesn't change, come over and develop this in collaboration with the Picasa team. And so, and I'll show you, so this was, we got this working, and it's actually released in the Picasa program. You can, if you use Picasa, you can try it on your own photos. There's a little button called the Face Movies button, which will do this. And I'll show you the Picasa version of actually the same collection that I've been talking about up to this point. All right, so this is the Picasa version. So a little bit more careful about presentation and rendering tricks here. And you can see more of the photo, the outlines. The graduation picture at the end, the marketing team really liked that. So. All right. Okay, so just to conclude, since I'm over time at this point, so there are trillions of photos. I think we've just scratched the surface of what's possible, but there are some extremely powerful tools that are now enabling us to do some really interesting analysis on these photos and produce some pretty exciting results. That's it. Thanks. Yes?
In the sparse to dense transformation, how do you decide what the right color and the right blur is?
For the point clouds, you mean?
Well, from going from sparse to dense.
Oh, yeah. So how do we find the color on the geometry and the blur? So all we're doing is for every point, so the dense geometry that I showed you is also just a point cloud. It's just a denser point cloud. And for every point, we're computing the images in which that point is visible and simply averaging the colors of those pixels, the simplest possible thing. Ideally, you would be, you'd be inferring the sun direction and inferring the lighting and the reflectance function and all this kind of stuff, but we haven't got there yet. Like the reconstruction algorithm? Yeah, so pose changes, so it works best if the images are near frontal, and we're basically throwing out images which aren't near frontal. We have this reprojection step that does the pose correction, but it only works well if the images are close to frontal. We shouldn't be doing that. Actually, the profile images are extremely useful. In fact, they're maybe the most informative about the shape, but right now we're not using them at all. The trouble is the profiles are harder to recognize using face recognition and detection algorithms. So that's really an open problem.